released 7 members of the deposed royal family, imprisoned without trial since the 1975 revolution. Ethiopian television has the story.
The State Council of the People's Democratic Republic of Ethiopia had on Saturday granted amnesty to 7 members of the former royal family. All of the beneficiaries were detained in 1974 at the onset of the Popular Revolution that did away with the government of Emperor Haile Selassie. The 7 who received amnesty were all female and were put under custody primarily for their own safety and to safeguard the gains of the revolution. Those who were granted amnesty include Wezero Tenanyo Haile Selassie, who is the daughter of the late emperor ousted from power by the Popular Revolution in 1974. The remaining 6 are Wezero Sara Gizau, Zuriash Work Gebረ እግዚአብሔር, and 4 granddaughters of the late emperor, namely Wezero Aida Desta, Seble Desta, Sophia Desta, and Hirut Desta. The grantees of the amnesty all expressed gratitude for the amnesty and for the human treatment they were given while in custody. Shfarao Gurmu, ATV News, reporting for CNN World Report.
A current Marxist government overthrew Emperor Haile Selassie in 1974 and jailed some members of his family. This past May, some of them were freed. Among them, Princess Aida Desta. Desta's husband saw his wife on that report for the first time in 14 years. He writes, "I would like to express my sincere thanks. The revelation of the unjust imprisonment of the royal family is heart-touching. I believe this report will show the world the injustice under which Ethiopia lives. I know you have broadcast numerous programs, and they have helped the public to have a better understanding of the military government." At a meeting, Ethiopian television has a report.
The National Shengo Parliament of the People's Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, which came into being in September last year, met this week for its regular second 3-day session to review the tasks accomplished in various socio-economic and political fields over the last 10 months. Various decrees and public notices, such as the draft proclamation on the national budget for 1981 Ethiopian year, July 1988 to June 1989, and draft proclamation on defining the boundaries of autonomous and administrative regions, as well as the draft proclamation and protocol governing the Republic's international relations and treaties were democratically discussed and approved by the Shengo during its meeting. The deputies observed a minute's silence in tribute to members of the National Shengo and of the Revolutionary Army who had made the ultimate sacrifice in the struggle to safeguard the unity and territorial integrity of the motherland prior to hearing President Mengistu's report. Comrade Mengistu's report presented to the National Shengo dealt with the accomplishment of the State Council since the first meeting of the National Shengo 10 months ago, as well as other internal and external issues. According to President Mengistu's report, the number of administrative regions has been raised from 24 to 25 following field studies conducted in the administrative regions, which the inaugural session of the Shengo established last year. The new provincial demarcation system has been worked out in line with the interests of the inhabitants of the locality and the assessment of conditions suitable for development and administration. Autonomous, administrative, and special administrative areas, as well as provincial government bodies, will be set up. In a report on the current situation in the northern part of the country, President Mengistu pointed out that the Ethiopian people, in unison with the Revolutionary Army, Revolutionary Defense Corps, and members of the National Military Service, have foiled the conspiracy of the suicidal mission of the separatist terrorist groups. On foreign relations, Comrade Mengistu stated that the special attention given by the PDRA's policy to peaceful coexistence and good neighborliness with its immediate neighbors has resulted in opening a new chapter in the long way towards forging healthy relations and fruitful cooperation between Ethiopia and its neighbors. The report pointed out that the efforts towards further strengthening relations and cooperation with socialist, developing, and Western nations will continue. The Shengo later heard the report of the government covering the tasks accomplished in various fields of development and economic situation of the country, presented by Prime Minister Selassie Ogdarras. In this report, it was indicated that the country's gross products will register a 4% growth during fiscal year 1989. According to the report, the bulk of the national budget for the year will go to the agricultural sector, with a special emphasis to attaining food self-sufficiency in the coming year. I'm Shifarao Gurmu, Ethiopian television for CNN World Report.
I left Ethiopia because of a conflict of conscience. I had a problem. I was loyal to the Ethiopian people. I served the Ethiopian people. I wanted to serve our people. But for me, it was difficult to make this balance between the human problems and the political priorities of my government.
This is the port of Baltimore. Back in 1984, huge freighters loaded their holds with emergency relief aid, food, medicines, blankets, and the like, and they sailed for Ethiopia. The response came as a result of BBC images of massive starvation. The international community, including millions of Americans, gave from the heart. Millions of lives were saved, but the optimism did not last, and neither did the giving. Today, 7 million Ethiopians face still another famine, potentially more devastating than the last one. The big question is why more and more people waver between compassion and skepticism as ongoing reports of political conflict and escalating war in Ethiopia replace images of starving children. In a conflict of conscience, Americans are asking the tough questions first.
In the next half hour, we will answer questions about food, money, politics, and a continuing devastating war that has aggravated the famine in Ethiopia. We will see firsthand the enormous conflict of conscience surrounding Ethiopia today. Within its northern provinces, Ethiopia has battled rebel factions for 27 years in the longest war in Africa's history. In the spring of 1988, that war escalated when greatly outnumbered Eritrean and Tigrayan rebel forces successfully launched a surprise offensive against Ethiopian troops. Thousands of Ethiopian soldiers were killed or captured. In retaliation, the government launched massive air attacks, cut back food distribution, and expelled foreign relief workers in the north. The result, the return of hunger. The new government motto is everything to the war front, as more than 160,000 Ethiopian soldiers move into combat. Understandably, there is a growing fear that the worst is yet to come. What keeps this bitter war going in the face of another killer famine? The answers are long and complex, but we begin to understand the issues by looking at some of Ethiopia's history of culture, politics, and famine. Ethiopia represents a diverse blend of nationalities, rich in culture and history. These proud and ancient people trace their roots back more than 2,000 years to biblical times, to the kingdom of Aksum, the reported birthplace of Ethiopian civilization. The Ethiopian Coptic Christian Church, still a strong cultural and religious force, dates back to the 4th century. A long succession of emperors mark Ethiopia's political history, among them Haile Selassie, the 225th ruler who assumed power in 1929. He reigned 45 years until drought and political turmoil fueled a Marxist-led revolution in 1974. The new government, led by Lieutenant Colonel Mengistu Haile Mariam, confronted the same situation in 1984 and 85 when another killer famine threatened millions of people. That famine gave rise to an unprecedented worldwide outpouring of compassion with efforts such as Band-Aid, Live Aid, and USA for Africa.
But if you just believe, there's nowhere we can fall.
Private relief agencies immediately reacted to the impending disaster, and urgently needed food began to arrive. Organizing this massive relief effort was difficult, and there was concern that supplies were not actually reaching the hungry.
People that I go up to, I'll say I work in Ethiopia, and people will say to me, oh, you work in Ethiopia, isn't it too bad about all that aid that was stolen?
I think the answer to the question concerning did the money get there is embodied in the fact that there are 10 million Ethiopians alive today because the whole world cared. The United Nations says that 99% of the commodities that were bought reached the docks. World Vision says, because we bought our own trucks and our own airplanes, that 95+% of the stuff that got to the docks got right to the camps.
I think there are two questions that donors ask us. One is the food getting through? And we can say without question that the food is getting through. The other is, why should we feed people in a communist country?
We feel, as organizations, that our first job is to save lives. That means being able to operate effectively, and that in turn has to mean for agencies that are working in most of Ethiopia having a good working relationship with the government.
It was not the most efficient operation, but it was effective.
In the end, millions of lives were saved, and 99% of the aid was verified as reaching its destination. After consistent rains in 1986, rainfall was sporadic the following year. Once again, farmers watched their fields scorched brown, their crops standing bent and broken, offering hunger instead of harvest.
It's going to be all over again, that kind of thing that we have gone through. People will start selling their household implements, their plowshares, their oxen, maybe their clothing too. And then they start migrating. They will maybe tear down their houses and sell the roofing, and they'll start walking into towns.
In late 1987, the United Nations and the Ethiopian government issued an early warning alert to the world. Because of erratic rainfalls, they said, some 1.3 million metric tons of food would need to be imported.
Without sustained assistance throughout the next 11 months, sure as day follows night, we're going to see those pictures which we were all horrified by in 1985 of starving children and starving adults.
Today, food pledges by governments may cover the shortfall, but distribution is yet another story. Some 50% of the Ethiopian people live more than 10 miles from a passable road. Relief trucks are in short supply. Many break down attempting to navigate nearly impassable terrain. Few relief agencies have the funds needed to transport the food once it reaches Ethiopia's ports. Contingency planning to overcome the problem began in earnest in early 1988. Agencies have adopted a strategy that attempts to avoid mass movement of people. The basic idea is to keep people at home on their farms and provide them with enough food so feeding centers are not needed. Even now, some people are walking up to 100 miles across craggy, remote terrain to pack up 1 month's ration of food and return home. no colonel is left behind.
I see the lack of food, the malnutrition, the infection getting worse. I see millions of people, lives being in jeopardy, and it can only spell disaster.
Although reports of starvation come from throughout Ethiopia, the worst affected areas continue to be in the northern provinces of Eritrea and Tigray. Here, the escalation of war cuts off desperately needed aid and threatens the lives of relief workers. 3 million people at risk fight more than drought.
In the last 2 days, the Ethiopian MiGs have come here and they have dropped the bombs. And you could see they have devastated the area. You could see the difference. The difference over here, it has been as green and better green than this one. But now you could see it, it looks as if it's dust. This is not the only place. With just few hundred meters, you'll see another bomb. And you could see the frequency and number of bombs being dropped here in this area. But by destroying all this, people would be go hungry and, of course, kneel down under their regime.
It's possible to carry out development programs while the war is continuing, because we cannot wait until everything is destroyed, and therefore we have started development programs.
Ethiopia's strength lies in its military power. Heavily backed by Russian aircraft and artillery, Ethiopia's 350,000-man army is the largest military force in Africa. The major governing force in Eritrea is the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, otherwise known as the EPLF.
We prefer to bring a negotiated settlement to the conflict, but that is nearly impossible. As you might have heard it recently, Mengistu Haile Mariam himself, he said, either us or them have to vanish.
In Tigray, the governing force is the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, the TPLF.
I don't see it getting better. I see it getting worse. Recently, because of the military situation in Tigray, the government is bombing towns.
The EPLF and the TPLF now control 80 to 90% of the territory, with the Eritreans functioning as a fully armed military force.
We have preferred to solve the conflict peacefully, but if the Ethiopian regime doesn't want it to be solved peacefully, we're going to show them how we're going to win, and we are going to win in the very recent future.
Although the two movements are often lumped together, the stated goals of each are radically different. In 1952, the United Nations joined Eritrea, a former Italian colony, with Ethiopia. 10 years later, in violation of international law, Emperor Selassie forcibly annexed Eritrea. Made up of 9 different ethnic groups, Eritrea struggles for total independence from Ethiopia.
We always say that we are not Ethiopians, we are not Ethiopians, we are not Ethiopians, we are Eritreans, we have got our own identity. Without Eritrea, I mean, I can't see where I can stand.
I am forced to say that I am an Ethiopian. But feeling-wise, sentiment-wise, the way I was raised, I wasn't raised as an Ethiopian. I wasn't raised as any other nationality, but as an Eritrean.
The Tigrayan conflict stems from a desire for equality within a multinational state.
And we are fighting for national equality and democratic rights. That our first alternative is to have a united democratic Ethiopia where people can have equal rights and participation.
The TPLF does not want an independent Tigrayan nation, however, recognizing that the Tigrayans are Ethiopians. The TPLF wants to promote unity within equality for all of Ethiopia's people. As the director of the Relief and Rehabilitation Commission in 1984 and 85, Dawit Georgis was Ethiopia's central figure in aid distribution during the last famine. Since then, he has defected to the United States.
All are going to be losers. The Ethiopian government is going to lose. The rebel movements are going to lose. And by far, many more Ethiopians are going to die.
The Ethiopian government's answer to peace lies in its new constitution, passed in late 1987.
It tries to solve the problem that we have in the north in a peaceful way. It's the constitution guarantees, autonomy, administrative, self-determination for the different nationalities within the country.
While supporters of the Constitution see it as a generous move, Eritreans condemn it as an attempt to divide and conquer. The Eritrean People's Liberation Front says it is not seeking a military solution to the conflict. The front proposes peace in the form of a referendum, leaving it up to voters to decide whether they want full independence, federal association with Ethiopia, or regional autonomy. Under the plan, however, the Ethiopian government would lose its only seaports. The plan could also set the stage for trouble from Ethiopia's Arab enemies.
I think it's important that we recognize that not only do 3 million Eritreans face the prospect of their land being turned into a free fire zone, but also that Ethiopia is a military government. If the military suffers a major defeat in Eritrea, the government itself is in jeopardy and the entire country could fall into anarchy.
Although the EPLF and the Ethiopian officials accuse each other of atrocities, both sides continue to put war before famine. Both sides say they have made attempts at peace, yet seem unwilling to compromise.
When the Eritrean people were trying to do something peacefully, the response they get from the other side was force. And they found out, we cannot fight fire without fire.
The secessionist elements have rejected any kind of peaceful gesture that has been given by the Ethiopian people and the government, and they are bent on their destructive activities.
Overall, Lieutenant Colonel Mengistu has drawn international criticism for his heavy-handed policies and violations of human rights. In retaliation against Ethiopia's human rights violations, U.S. Congressman Toby Roth and William Gray have proposed a bill stopping imports of Ethiopian coffee and other products.
What we're saying is that we want some leverage over the Mengistu regime, because we have had a huge Holocaust in 84, 85, when thousands upon thousands starved, and now it's a reoccurring problem. The famine is coming back, and it's going to be worse than it was before.
There are some of us who would advise that that is not the proper thing to do, particularly at this time when things are so critical.
Mengistu has urged the Congress not to act on the bill, stressing the need for improved relations between America and Ethiopia.
The child who's dying of infection, who doesn't know a Marxist from a capitalist, and all he wants to do is to live.
As factions continue fighting, thousands suffer. Relief agencies find themselves prime targets as they move across borders with food supplies. Since 1987, 90 trucks have been destroyed. The result, loss of life, loss of food, loss of valuable transportation.
As the war escalates in Ethiopia, relief and development agencies have become frequent targets of attack. Lives have been lost, yet the subject of peace is often disagreed upon.
For relief agencies, the natural question then becomes, how do we bring about peace? Should relief agencies take an active voice in pressuring for peace, or leave it to the diplomats?
I think that that the notion that private voluntary organizations can act outside of politics in an essentially political crisis is a myth. It's not possible.
Two things could happen if we took an anti-governmental stand. One, our entire operation in Ethiopia could be shut down. And secondly, we would put 110 Ethiopian employees, World Vision Ethiopia, in instant jeopardy. And obviously we don't want to do that.
But I cannot understand why independent international agencies are not criticizing this government. They must criticize the government. Otherwise, this government conducts its routine with impunity.
I think there are a lot of people who feel that we can take a stand and that this will somehow advance the process. I think that peace is something in a situation of such bitterness, such conflict, with such brutality, that the peace process can only be advanced quietly.
I think the PVOs are going to have to be very, very assertive without at the same time alienating the government, because alienation of the government achieves nothing for the victims.
In order to continue to provide effective aid, we need to become more professional, more knowledgeable about political complexities, more attuned to why conflicts are breaking out, and therefore more resourceful and creative in the kinds of aid that we make available.
While relief agencies frantically work to avert another famine, there is growing public concern that Ethiopia will remain endlessly dependent on relief aid. Can Ethiopia ever become self-sufficient in the face of continual cyclical drought and political conflict?
Virtually all agencies agree that long-term development is the key to overcoming the ravaging effects of cyclical drought. In addition to war, the drought problem in Ethiopia, as well as in other parts of northern Africa, has continued to worsen over the past century. At the turn of the century, 40% of Ethiopia was covered by thick forests. Today, only 4% of the country is covered with trees and other vegetation. 1 billion tons of valuable topsoil have been washed away. A number of aid agencies are undertaking long-term development projects in partnership with local peasant associations and Ethiopian relief and development agencies. One such development effort, operated by Save the Children, is providing primary health assistance and other help in the north-central province of Shoa.
We are very keen on the immunization program, which was begun during the height of the famine. Between 70 and 80% of the susceptible kids have complete immunization for all the vaccinatable diseases.
This program has been chosen by the Ethiopian Ministry of Health as a model to be used throughout the country.
Development is one of the biggest issues in Ethiopia today, and when we talk about development, we're talking about the simplest actions that can take place at the grassroots, but activities by people themselves to build a well, to improve their agricultural techniques, to improve the health of their children. Those projects are going forward all over Ethiopia.
The project includes agricultural improvement, community vocational training, care for orphans, construction of latrines, and the provision of fresh water. Another project is operated by World Vision, a Christian relief and development agency that has been active in Ethiopia since 1972. The Ansokya Valley area of Ethiopia, says World Vision, is now famine resistant. In 2 years, what was once a feeding